My name is Robert Scarlett. I'm a volunteer historian here at the Summerville Museum and Research Center. I also proudly serve as a teacher at Fort Dorchester High School, where I teach social studies. So let's just talk about what we're going to be talking about tonight. Today is Juneteenth. So hopefully you all will celebrate Juneteenth with us. And tonight we're really going to focus on why is Juneteenth important for all Americans. And one way I want to do that is to walk you through the different stages of what I call the 5 stages, basically from slavery to freedom and beyond. And within those stages, we'll talk about everything from coming from Africa, going through the Middle Passage, and all those aspects of what it took to get to this holiday. How did we get here? So let's walk through the stages. Stage 1, as I talk about, really deals with the African continent. And how did it really begin? And sadly, we must acknowledge that the majority of the enslaved that were taken out of Africa was captured by other Africans. So that originally started with them capturing Africans, marching them to the Atlantic coast, where they were sold to people on the beach, usually Europeans, and transported to what we call the Americas. What a lot of people don't realize is that less than 5% of the 12.5 million Africans that were stolen from the continent ended up in what we call the United States, with the largest going to places like Brazil that got 40%. So during that first stage, I break it into 3 different parts. We talk about their capture and transportation out of Africa. Then we talk about the terrible Middle Passage and the things that happened on board those slave ships. And finally, when they arrived in places like Charleston, South Carolina, which is that final part, where they were again resold, transported to local plantations, and going out as far as Florida, Georgia, and so forth. But we also talk about where they came in Charleston, which is what's known as Gaston's Wharf. That is why the new International African American History Museum is located at Gaston's Wharf. That is where the slave ships originally came in. And then we transition to their time here in America, and the fact that despite we don't talk about it in the history books, they didn't just come here and accept their condition. There was over 800 slave revolts in America. And that only counts those that had at least 10 rebels during that ordeal. So they fought for their own freedom during that time period. And that leads us up to what we talk about in the Civil War, which is another form actually of resistance. Because once President Lincoln allowed African Americans to join the Union Army, that was another way to fight for their freedom. And once that door opened, more than 180,000 African Americans joined the Union Army, representing 10% of the final fighting force. So that is a way in which African Americans really helped to emancipate themselves. And we come out of that going all the way from the Civil War leading into the Emancipation Proclamation, which said that on January 1st, 1863, all slaves in states that were still in rebellion against the Union would now be free. Now, we all know that didn't actually happen because the Confederate States of America did not acknowledge the leadership of Abraham Lincoln, so therefore they ignored that order. So it really didn't lead to a lot of enslaved Africans being set free. But it did set us on that path. So when we go through Juneteenth, we go through the Emancipation Proclamation, that's what's going to actually lead us to what we call Juneteenth. And Juneteenth comes from a date, and that date is June 19th, 1865. On June 19th, 1865, Union General Granger rode into what is now Galveston, Texas. We called it Galveston Bay at that time, with over 2,000 troops to tell 250,000 enslaved Africans who were supposed to have already been liberated that you all are free. And now they had to make that transition from being enslaved Africans to paid laborers. Imagine that transition for someone during that time frame. But Juneteenth is based on that date, June 19th, 1865, when they were the last of those in the Confederate states were set free. But stand by. When you listen to my presentation, if you come out to our if you're attending the lecture tonight during Third Thursday, you're going to learn that slavery, unfortunately, did not end during Juneteenth. We celebrate the end of slavery in the Confederate States, but it really did not end for another year. So we'll talk about why is that. We'll talk about the role of Union states that didn't give up their slaves like they were supposed to. So the Confederate States actually ended up ending slavery before the Union actually did. So that'd be an interesting aspect of it. And then we get to that final aspect that even though the Union states were forced to give up enslaved Africans after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, we still had slavery in the United States territory. How was that possible? That's when we start talking about the role of the American Indian and the role they played during that time. The American Indian was both the tormentor and the savior of enslaved Africans during that time, depending on what you're looking at. Many of the enslaved Africans escaped to places like Florida and became part of the community, even married into that community as freemen. But there were others, like the Cherokee, who held on to enslaved Africans. So we'll talk about that and what finally ended. How do we end slavery in the United States with negotiations with the American Indian? So that is a lot of history that we'll talk about. A couple of 100 years, all in a little 15-minute presentation, neatly put together for you from the Summerville Museum and Research Center. So let me add this, that every third Sunday of the month, we do a historical lecture here at the museum at 2 p.m. Every third Sunday. It's not always about African American history, it is about Summerville history. We have lectures coming up on the train. How did the railroad get its start here in Summerville? We got lectures coming up about, hopefully, the indigenous people of Summerville. What is their history? So please, come check us out at the museum, and then hopefully you'll be able to enjoy our lecture tonight during Third Thursday. See you there.